Now that Putin has won election, the Kremlin has declared war on the entire West. This is coming from a Kremlin spokesperson, so it should be at least sort of credible. We are going to talk about that, plus the U.S. begging Ukraine to stop targeting Russian oil refineries. We're going to talk about why right now. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is really interesting. The Kremlin, in what Reuters calls a change of language, says Russia is, quote, at war due to the West's role in Ukraine. Now, that's not actually what the quote was. It is, quote, we are in a state of war. This is, by the way, coming to us from the Kremlin spokesperson. So it's fair to say that this is the Kremlin's at least official public stance. We quote, we are in a state of war. Yes, it started out as a special military operation, but as soon as this group was formed, when the collective West became a participant on the side of Ukraine, it became a war for us. This is from Peskov, and he says, quote, I am convinced of that, and everyone should understand this for their internal motivation. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, now that Putin has won election and is in for another 6 years and cannot, he wasn't ever really going to be ousted from power, but he has what he believes is a mandate from the people, which is not really true, right? If you have a non-secret ballot and you're voting at gunpoint, it's really obvious who you should vote for. It's the person who is in charge of the people with the guns. That's a survival tip from your boy Paul. But what I thought was really interesting, right? As they point out that as Reuters points out, right, this sounds pretty unremarkable to Ukrainian and Western ears, right? Versions of this have appeared in Putin's public statements for a long time about NATO combatants. NATO mercenaries is his term for foreign volunteers. Emphasizing the NATO equipment. But inside Russia, as Reuters points out, people have been told for the past 2 years the war in Ukraine is a, quote, special military operation, a phrase designed to underline the initially limited nature of the conflict and a departure, and this is a huge departure from that. And the thinking among some analysts is that this may be a shift in Russian talking points in order to prepare Russia for a longer, more protracted conflict. Now, that could take a couple of forms. It could mean pivoting the Russian economy even more onto a war footing than it already is. Right now, it's able to produce artillery shells and munitions at a scale that basically no other Western country can match, unfortunately. Even the United States is still years away from being able to approach Russian ability to manufacture 155 shells, right? The EU is even further away still. They can't even get themselves together enough to make a large purchase of 155 shells, let alone manufacture some in-house. But so that is Russia's tremendous material advantage. But Putin may also be preparing the public for a draft, for an actual capital M mobilization, in which military-age men are drafted, trained, and sent to fight, right? And of course, as we've pointed out in this channel, for Russia, you have to get the defense industrial base first. And Russia's kind of solved that problem, right? We've seen over time that Russia's equipping issues with its troops appear to be moving towards resolution, right? We see at least individual troops, when we see them on the battlefield, they have helmets, they have body armor, and they have assault rifles. These are basically the three core components of a light infantry formation, at least in individual troops, like basic equipment in the modern battlefield. And so the fact that these troops have these means, at least presumably, that Russia's kind of solved some of its military pipeline issues, which means that it's now ready to scale up the number of actual soldiers it brings in, trains, and deploys to the front. And so the fear is that reality that this statement is preparing the Russian public for that eventuality. And there's also some, I believe, some legal ramifications when the Kremlin or the government declares this a war, right? When something is a special military operation, it's considered legally peacetime in Russia. Now, bear in mind, the terms like legal status and authorities don't mean that much in Russia. They're more performative than they are real, but it's important for Putin to maintain the performance of legality. And so now that he's using words like war, he's able to likely consolidate certain powers and authorities. Again, he's able to force Russian industry to adopt a more war footing, and almost certainly some powers are going to consolidate to the Russian government, to the Kremlin. So this is all a sign, as we talked about yesterday, that Russia is really thinking this is going to be a long war, a grueling war, and he thinks Russia's going to have to go up against at least some NATO troops. Now, here's the problem. There is a problem with this, and we're going to talk in a second about the strange statements from the United States, but I wanted to point something out. The problem is right now, the entire weight of the Russian military is still advancing at a rate of, what's this, a couple of acres, maybe 500 meters of open field. That's what they've taken today. The entire weight of the Russian armed forces can advance a little bit in an open field north of Tonenka. Now, don't get me wrong. The Russian forces do have momentum in their favor, but they are not, for example, weeks away from Kiev, and boy howdy, they are really not positioned well to take on like Warsaw, right? So this is why I point out that while Putin's rhetoric might be increasing, we have to comport it to reality. And the reality is the full weight of the Russian armed forces right now cannot break the stalemate with Ukraine, who, by the way, is currently fighting a war without its biggest aid partner, the United States. Yeah, the United States, right? We haven't provided them aid in a long time. So this is against a diminished and attrited Ukrainian military. And they still are just barely advancing. And so, yeah, I know the Russian trolls are going to come in the comments and be like, they're just resting. Like, oh, okay, man, sure. Like, stop resting whenever. But like, we all saw how long it took you to take Avdiivka. So, I point this out because at that rate, we're only a few hundred years away from the Russians reaching Kiev. If they continue to take towns, if it takes them 3 months to take a mid-sized town, yeah, we're looking at, they could do it in less than 100 years. They could get to Kiev. So not exactly a stunning victory by the Russian. Russia's not exactly on pace to, roll over to the Atlantic. Now, if you're interested in getting this and other national security news sent straight to your inbox for free, you want to check out the Strategic Sit Rep. The Strategic Sit Rep is my newsletter. I've got it written by DC insiders who I've sort of become friends with throughout my years in DC. And so they pick out some of the most relevant stories in the entire national security space, and they send them right to your inbox. Some of them are ones you already know, like Vladimir Putin winning a non-competitive election. And exactly what we do is we distill the stories in a non-biased way, right? We don't have an angle. We're not the New York Times. We're not Fox News. We don't have a spin. We just want to give you the facts, and then we give you the so what. Why do you need to know this story, right? What does it mean for the globe, right? And there's also some stories that you may not know about that are still relevant, right? For example, the Haitian prime minister set to resign as the gang-fueled and humanitarian crisis escalates, right? And again, we're not here to spin it one way or the other. We give you the facts, and then we tell you why you need to know it. And it's free, right? We literally don't run ads. I think sometimes we put a link to Strike Gum at the bottom. I think that's it. But basically, it is absolutely free to sign up at strategicsitrep.com. Link is in the description. Check it out. Okay, now here's one more story that I thought was absolutely bananas, right? And this is the U.S. urging Ukraine to stop attacking Russian oil refineries, right? And Washington fears oil prices rising and extra retaliation from Moscow. Now, here's what I thought was really interesting. The U.S. publicly is saying we're pressing Ukraine to halt drone strikes on Russian energy facilities, fearing that it could provoke massive retaliation and drive up global oil prices. Now, we know that if Russia's goal is to expand its military and defense industrial base to grow an even larger military, it needs cash money. And while they've been able to circumvent the sanctions and find people who are willing to buy Russian oil, this is actually, and just the global inflation crisis has actually pushed oil prices even higher, meaning that Russia is actually more well-funded now than it was when it invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. And so the targeting of Russian oil is actually a strategic decision by Kiev in order to sort of cut Russia's planned expansion off at the knees, right? And they've hit several Russian oil refineries. And I'm going to be honest, I was skeptical. I thought Kiev's efforts would be largely symbolic, that they really wouldn't be able to diminish Russian oil production capacity in a meaningful way. But I apparently have been incorrect. One analysis I saw said that about 10% of Russia's oil refining capability has been taken offline as a result of Kiev's strikes. So I did not assess both the vulnerability of Russia's energy infrastructure and the effectiveness of Kiev's drone program, which again, I have just continually, I was someone who was early to say that drones were going to change the game, but even I underestimated how much. Right? So what's interesting is, of course, that this urging was done publicly, and that, interestingly enough, the Ukrainians, of course, told them to fuck off. Right? They said, quote, "We understand the calls of our American partners." The spokesperson for the this is Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration. She said, quote, "At the same time, we are fighting with the capabilities, resources, and practices that we have," right? And this is what was interesting is that the U.S.'s fears, they claim it's because they fear that Russia will launch some kind of massive retaliation. I don't think that's true. I think if Russia, as we've talked about, let's say Putin wakes up, he goes, "F these guys, we need our oil, this is existential, we're going to violate a 70-year-old prohibition on nuclear weapons," which is really the only escalation Russia can take other than a full mobilization, which, as we discussed, without oil revenues won't be very pleasant for Russia. It might not even be possible. If he decides to do that, where are you going to nuke, dude? You're gonna drop a bomb on Kiev? Will that actually, it'll make the Ukrainians very mad. It'll kill a lot of civilians, but will it end the war? No, it won't. There's still lots of Ukrainian cities. Most of the government has gone to Lviv. They're like, okay, well, maybe they nuke Lviv. Well, even that may not really be all that effective, given that it's about as far as possible from the Ukrainians, and it risks creating a dangerous escalation. So I say this, and none of those things are going to stop Ukrainian drones, right? The Ukrainian drones are launched from a dozen different locations in Ukraine, right? There's no one drone spot. So Russia may not have a lot of good ideas on how to stop this. And the U.S., though, is mad, probably not because Russia will escalate in some vague way, but that they're probably mad because it's going to drive up oil prices. And you guys know that Biden is up for re-election, and one of his largest electoral vulnerabilities is the inflation, right? The fact that the average American, despite all the economic data saying things are better for the country, to the average American, the cost of just basic survival is so much more expensive. And a lot of that is driven by oil, right? Because the price of fuel impacts not just the gas you put in your car, but it impacts the cost of everything that's shipped in a truck, right? So that shipment of apples, the price of every apple has the fuel cost baked into it, right? So Biden needs to keep fuel prices low, even if that means allowing Russia to continue to sell oil internationally, right? Even though they're sanctioned, right? If you sell oil to India, that means India doesn't have to buy oil, for example, from other markets, keeping the price low. So overall, again, I think this is a story of the U.S. policy just being really dumb I don't know how else to put it. Really unfocused, right? And here's the other problem. What leverage do we have over Ukraine? We're already not supporting them. Literally all we can do is ask them, pretty please don't strike Russia. And that's actually, I think, not an accident, right? Tinfoil hat time. I think the reason this was publicly leaked, because again, this is a conversation between high-level Washington officials and the Ukrainian special services, right? So this is, if this conversation didn't want to get out in the public, it wouldn't have. And somebody wanted this publicly known. And I think it's the United States. I think the United States wanted to publicly be aware, make Russia aware, to say, listen, this is not our idea. We are not on board with this, but we can't stop the Ukrainians because we cannot get them an aid bill. Now, if we were the ones funding them, then we would be able to say, yo, if you want our money, you cannot strike Russian oil facilities. And that's a better deal. That's a negotiable position. But without leverage, all we can do is beg them, pretty please don't hit them. But of course, the Ukrainians, they're like, dude, you already stopped helping us. You already don't do anything. So like, what are you going to do? Do less of nothing? So anyway, that is the story there. And we're going to see if this actually has any effect. Again, I don't think it will. And I don't think the U.S. expects it to. I think the U.S. is really just like, no, don't hit Russian oil refineries. We can't bear to see oil prices increase. And Ukrainians will go, no, we're going to keep doing it until you give us a reason not to. And that will be the status quo, which is honestly fine. I don't know. I'm not that. I think you should just, like, the U.S. can afford, if you wanted, one, the U.S. is a net oil exporter. So if we wanted to, we could just export less oil and sell it domestically. Two, the U.S. could absolutely subsidize more efficient engines, hybrid vehicles, take your pick, in order to make it less expensive to buy and ship goods, as well as fuel up your car. And there's lots of other solutions to this other than keep oil cheap, which is also just like bothers me, because it's like, if you elected the American Democratic Party for climate change reasons, like let's say you're a climate change voter and you're like, listen, I put these guys in office because they're the ones who say they're going to do something about climate change. Well, now we are literally like shooting our ally in the foot in order to keep oil cheap, something that in order to make climate change worse, right? Like, do you see how preposterous a policy that is? And then the Democrats are like, why aren't we more popular? I'm like, because you do shit like this. Okay, that is all my complaints for today. Maybe I might have one more story in another video that I drop that is just crazy. So anyway, thanks so much to our Kernel Tier members. Please, if you like my content, if you think I do a good job, hit the like button. It's free, doesn't cost you nothing, and hit subscribe. Right? I try to make good content for you guys. See ya.